People who are really gung-ho about the idea of opening schools this fall often talk about using what are called hybrid models, where students spend some amount of time on campus face to face and the rest of their time not on campus doing some kind of remote learning. And the idea is that hybrid models are supposed to capture the fact that when you're in small groups, transmission is in principle less likely. On the other hand, most of the people who talk about hybrid models don't really understand hybrid models or how they work. Somebody who does is Dr. William Hanage of the Department of Epidemiology at Harvard, who says that the hybrid model is probably among the worst that we could be putting forward if our goal is to stop the virus getting into schools. And so what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about how hybrid models work and why that's the case. And I'm going to start with a family like you see here, two parents, a child. Suppose that a parent brings home COVID into the house. It's really fairly likely that that COVID is going to be passed around in the house. In-home transmission, it has far and away the highest attack rate of any environment. And so what that means is now you've got a parent and a kid with COVID. And if you're doing remote learning, transmission stops there. It doesn't go anywhere. On the other hand, if you're trying to do some kind of a get the kid out and into a school setting, probably the safest version of that is you just have a completely isolated cohort of not very many students, and that isolated cohort has one teacher and they meet every day, and that's that. Now, I will say that there are lots of examples of isolated cohorts like that blowing up at this point. But still, there you go. You've got an isolated cohort. You've got a kid who's got COVID. Classrooms are extremely dangerous environments. If you look at the places that COVID spreads most easily, close-up person-to-person interactions for extended periods, crowds, poorly ventilated areas, places where people are talking and singing, those are the kinds of places that maximize the risk. And that's a pretty good description of how a classroom works. The long periods of time is kind of especially important when you talk about classrooms. In an isolated 9-student cohort like this, you're talking about those 10 people spending maybe 135 hours a month in very close contact. So you get a few people and they go into a bar and they hang around for long enough to get a drink, and many people wind up catching COVID. Now you're talking about 135 hours a month for months on end. So the exposure is really pretty dramatic, especially when you're dealing with kids who it's very unlikely they're going to respect safety procedures. One of the things that people talk about is all of the things that people can do to protect themselves, just like healthcare workers. The problem, of course, is that kids and teachers have not been trained like healthcare workers. That comparison just doesn't work. And it's especially bad in school settings because kids tend to be asymptomatic. So they can spread the disease all over the place, and you don't really know about it until you have a full-fledged outbreak on your hands. So there you are, kids come in, 50% attack rate maybe, other kids get it, the teacher gets it, and then of course the people who are infected carry it back out into the community, into their homes. So there you go. There's your isolated cohort. Far less safe than having 100% remote learning. But we're not really talking about an isolated cohort like this. You know, an isolated cohort like this is very much the province of people who have enough money to pay for a situation where you've got a 9-to-1 student-teacher ratio that lasts forever. In the kinds of settings that people usually talk about this, they're talking about something like a 3-day rotating hybrid, where you have several groups of kids and one is together on day one is together on day two, one is together on day three, and they just keep rotating like that. And you've got one teacher among them because you can't really change the teacher pupil ratio from what it is in a normal situation. So you've got one teacher still teaching like 27 students, except it's spread between 3 groups like that. Now, in this case, we are already in the situation where there's a lot of infection here because you had this kid come in and transmit it, and the teacher catches it, which means now you have somebody infectious in all 3 days of that hybrid, all 3 cohorts. And so you could very well get transmission there because the teacher is a vector of transmission between cohorts. Now, in the 1 day on, 2 day off hybrids, the other problem you have is that a kid is spending 1 day at school and then 2 days not at school. So what's happening in the 2 days not at school? There are a variety of possibilities, but for a lot of kids, likely they're going to wind up in childcare settings. And so here we've got a childcare setting where you've got kids that are from this group who are now in this childcare setting with other children who aren't part of that. And so you've got COVID being passed around within this group. And from this group, you're getting it passed back into homes. But a bunch of the kids in the childcare are going to be from different schools, which means that now you also have transmission into other schools. And so with a 1 day on, 2 day off hybrid, you have immediately greatly increased the size of the network that you're going to be dealing with, bringing COVID into the situation. But of course, that's just one classroom. And in that classroom, you've got these 3 groups. There's still going to be a very high danger of transmission. In fact, higher. Again, for the children, they're spending 45 hours a month in close contact with other people. You get a super spreader in this group, and chances are they're going to be in a class at some point when they are very highly contagious, in close contact with 9 other people for something like 45 hours a month. But for teachers, they're still in the room 6.5 hours a day. They're still in the room 135 hours a month. They are still in very close contact with 27 other people, which means that from a teacher's standpoint, there might not be an awful lot of difference between this and what happens if you're just in a class of 30 people or something. But you also have to ask, why would anybody do this in the first place? I mean, if you're doing completely remote learning, then the kid has a nice schedule. Every day the kid is there in a virtual space with peers, a virtual space with a teacher who is there to work with them every day. It's not a bad environment, quite frankly. Whereas in this hybrid environment, you've got a kid, okay, they're face-to-face 1 day out of 3. Of course, what that means is they're face-to-face and they're wearing masks and they can't get within 6 feet of their friends, and they're having to look forward because you can't actually go face-to-face, and they're not able to share anything, and they're not actually able to get close to each other to talk. And they're only there for 1 day out of 3. And so it is completely unclear how that does anything whatsoever to actually meet social and emotional needs of these kids, which seems to be one of the big drivers. But the other thing is that this one classroom is just one classroom in a larger school. And you can get interactions between those. For example, the majority of public schools have not very good ventilation. And in particular, they have ventilation that shares air between different rooms. For example, in Arizona, it's hot, and that means that you can't have open windows and open doors, and you can't be bringing air in from the outside because it's prohibitive to try to cool it. And so mostly what you're doing is you're just passing around the same air inside. COVID is airborne, which means that if you're here in this setting, maybe they're on day 3, you have lots of contagion here, and airborne, maybe you then pass that contagion to day 3 of this class, and if that includes the teacher, now again you have the problem that the teacher is a vector between cohorts. So you get airborne spread, and then that gives rise to even more spread. There are other things that happen. You get workplace interactions between teachers, for example. They get together to plan. They do those sorts of things. There was a case in Arizona this year where over the course of the summer, there were 3 teachers that were getting together to do planning, and they were wearing masks and all that stuff, and all 3 of them caught it, and 1 of them died. So you're going to get that kind of transmission, where now, again, you've got a teacher who is there with 3 different cohorts, and maybe this teacher transmits to a couple of those cohorts. Okay. Now I want you to look at what's going on over here. You've got a kid here, and this kid has contracted COVID in the classroom. This kid has siblings, and so this kid takes COVID home. Again, the household is the best place to transmit COVID, and so a sibling gets it. Well, that sibling is in another class, so now you have a kid who's infected who is now wound up in another cohort and spreads it, and if the teacher gets it, now the teacher can spread it to other cohorts as well. And so there are all manner of paths by which COVID can spread here. It's important to note here that teachers can be especially hard hit in any kind of a hybrid model. They're spending huge amounts of time in very high-risk environments. They're being exposed not to just one little cohort, but they're being exposed to lots of kids. They're subject to many different paths of possible infection. And if you look, about 1/4 to 1/3 of teachers in the United States fall in high-risk categories for COVID. So you were taking people who are vulnerable and you were putting them in extraordinarily dangerous environments where COVID can come at them in all sorts of ways. But of course, you also have the issue that COVID is carried from the schools back into homes again. So there we go. We have COVID carried into a home, and that's happening a lot. So you've got a bunch of homes now that COVID is spreading from the school back out into the community. In those homes, parents, siblings are going to get it. And then, of course, all of that winds up getting carried back into the community. So schools serve as places where you can really amplify COVID and then spit it right back out into the community where it enhances community spread. And it all started with a single transmission that would have gone nowhere if learning had been remote. So there we are. We've got as I drew it here, you've got 4 classes. But of course, those 4 classes are really part of a school. Okay? So here we've got a system of many, many classes. They're interacting with each other in all of these different ways. COVID, the more complex a system gets, the more ways there are for COVID to spread and multiply. And this is one school out of many, because we're not talking about just a single school. We're talking about lots of schools. So here we go. We've got a district and there are lots of schools around. Well, there are interactions between these schools. For example, what about substitute teachers? You're going to have you have to have substitutes. Those substitutes are going to be moving between classes within schools. They're going to be moving between schools. They're going to be having lots of exposure time. And so now all of the schools that are dealing with those substitutes are now part of a network where COVID can spread. And of course, this is all happening within the context of across all of these schools. You are spreading out into homes where you can have contagion, and again, that goes off into the community spread. You've got, again, things like the child care center, which is another place that's part of this network where things are spreading, and so on and so forth. And so what happens here is that school districts that are running these kinds of hybrid models just become places where the virus is amplified tremendously and spread out into the community. Now, that's what it looks like. That's the situation that you generate if you decide that you're going to try to go with these one cohort every 3 days kinds of settings. I don't know of any epidemiologists that have tried to tackle this problem, frankly, because it is an extremely complex and chaotic problem. It's the kind of problem that is just hard to solve, just hard to understand, extremely hard to control, which takes us back to the statement of our epidemiologist from Harvard. The hybrid model is probably among the worst that we could be putting forward if our goal is to stop the virus getting into schools. So there you go. That's why. Now, unfortunately, the people who are making decisions about this tend not to understand any of what we just talked about. For example, I had a board member tell me, I would like to see ways teachers use their growth mindset, and the quotes were this person's, and see how they can help make their campuses safe. This has got to be one of the most absurdly naive statements I have ever heard in my life. It's not that this board member is a bad person. It's not that this board member doesn't want what's good for schools and kids. It's just that this board member, somehow teachers are going to use their growth mindset to figure out something that epidemiologists the world over can't grapple with? Come on. So there it is. That's the kind of complex, chaotic network that you generate with that nice, okay, 1 day on, 2 days off, we're going to go nice, sweet little cohorts in a hybrid model. That's the kind of network for spreading COVID that you wind up generating if you actually try it. If you think that's going to be safe, if you think that's going to work, just give me a break. Go on, pull the other leg.